Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today, we are going to be looking at the rise of empires, and we'll be looking at it from the years 900 to 500 BC. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to analyze the political and military strategies of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in their impact on imperial expansion and control, explain the role of ideology and religion in Assyrian and Persian rule, including the concept of divine authority, describe the administrative and ideological foundations of the Persian Empire, compare the Assyrian approach to empire building, focusing on their methods of government, military control, and integrating diverse peoples. Okay, so grab a pen and paper, a tablet and a keyboard, and let's get going. Well, the first thing that I want to address is, what is an empire? And I'll say right off the bat that there isn't a widely agreed upon definition that everybody is going to satisfy everyone. So, but in general, we can say it's a political system that uses coercive power. Empires are typically larger than territorial states. And this is where it gets kind of fuzzy. When does a territorial state become an empire? One of the dividing lines is when the territorial state becomes a multi-ethnic state. Again, this doesn't completely clear things up because there's some maybe large multi-ethnic territorial states, but some of these are characteristics of an empire, that uses coercive power, that it's larger than a territorial state, and it's multi-ethnic. Some key characteristics are also that it has a core region of people, and that core region benefits at the expense of other regions. So we're looking at a map of Assyria right here. The heartland of Assyria was the heartland of its empire, and then it kind of lived off of other areas. As I said, usually there's an ethnic core that lives off of the other ethnicities. And we'll see that empires often have some sort of imperial ideology that legitimizes this rule either through religious or some philosophical reason. Okay. Now, I don't expect that clears things up incredibly, but it at least gives us something to go off of. Empires have been incredibly important in world history. They're one of the most transformative structures that we have. Before the modern era, that is, well, I mean, and by modern here, I mean before like the mid 20th century, most people lived in an empire of some sort. All right, so they've been really common. Most people, I would dare say most people throughout history have lived in some empire. We live in a time where there's not a ton of empires, although there are some. But this is kind of an irregularity, and it may change back again for all we know. So empires, rightly or wrongly, have a bad reputation. But they do things that do change history. Whether they're good or not, I'll leave up to you. They do facilitate the exchange of ideas. When you get a lot of people living together in one political unit, they do facilitate people communicating with each other. They facilitate not only philosophical ideas, but religious ideas. Many of the major world religions spread because of an empire of some sort. They also facilitate the exchange of goods. Okay, and so empires can facilitate goods and also technologies. Though they're often brutal, empires do enforce peace, or at least try to. And so empires will enforce peace over large areas, and this will enable commerce because people can travel freely. And it will also stimulate monumental building. Empires will often extract resources and use these toward large building projects. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at two of the very first empires. And these are going to be Assyria, who's going to, at least in the West, pioneer the concept. And we're going to see that they're going to use some pretty harsh militaristic techniques. And that while this will forge an empire, it will eventually alienate many of their subjects. We're going to look at another great empire, and this is the Persian Empire. And we're going to see that the Persian Empire uses a softer approach and ultimately creates a more stable system of government, and to some degree brings ideological unity across the Middle East. Okay, so let's look at the Assyrians. Where do the Assyrians begin? Well, the Assyrians begin on the upper Tigris River. So we have the Tigris River here. We have the Euphrates River here. The Assyrians begin in this triangular-shaped area on the upper Tigris. So they're a Mesopotamian civilization, to be sure. And we have evidence from the Assyrians dating way, way back to about 2600 BC. This was a good area in many ways because it had some fertile land. The Assyrian homeland, the original city of Assyria was a city called Ashur, and there was an important ford there. And so it was a place that people would cross back and forth. The area was also near the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, and so they had access to metals and timber. And as we go through the Bronze Age, Assyria's fortunes are going to wax and wane. During the Bronze Age, they were a state, but they weren't a particularly large or powerful state for most of that period. Toward the late Bronze Age, they started to get powerful. They were part of that late Bronze Age club that we talked about in our previous lecture, that included New Kingdom Assyria, the Hittites, New Kingdom Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, the Mycenaeans, the Aegean civilizations, and Assyria was part of that, although by no means were they the most powerful. During the upheavals brought about by the Sea Peoples as part of that Bronze Age collapse, Assyria contracted in power, but not as bad as everybody. All right, so they were weakened like everybody else, but not as bad. And in actuality, it kind of benefited them because once things settled down, they were doing okay, and now all their competitors were weaker. Now, the Assyrians had long worshipped a god by the name of Ashur, who they believed was the supreme god over all other gods. And they believed that the Assyrian king was his agent on earth. This wasn't an unusual belief in Mesopotamia. We only need to think back to Hammurabi and his relationship with Marduk. Where the Assyrians differed, though, was they came to believe that their god Ashur had commanded the king to conquer the world on his behalf. And so when the Assyrians conquered, they were motivated not only by economic or political motivation, but religious motivations. Each time they were successful in battle, it further proved in their mind that Ashur was pleased with them, and it only motivated them to go out and conquer a new territory. Let me read to you a quote by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal II. When the god Ashur, my great lord, who called me by name, made my kingship supreme over the kings of the four quarters of the world, and had made my great name supreme, he placed his merciless weapons in my lordly arms, and sternly commanded me, rule and subdue, and direct the lands and mighty mountains. And so, under this imperative, the Assyrians began to break out of their homeland and to expand. Earlier kings had been servants of the gods, and earlier gods had been lords over particular cities, but the Assyrian innovation was that their god was the god of an empire, a god of the entire world, and it was their prerogative to spread this god's lordly rule over all the peoples of the earth. Now, the Assyrians weren't just religiously innovative, but they were also very militarily innovative. You may remember that the Iron Age brought a whole bunch of new uses for tools, but also for weapons. And the Assyrians were early adoptees of this new technology. They outfitted their populace with this new technology at a time when many others were still using bronze weapons. They had a large population that was now well armed, and the Assyrians honed these skills and increasingly professionalized their army. They came up with distinct units, with specially trained generals. They campaigned continuously, and they invented new types of weapons like siege engines, towers, rams, sappers, to enable their forces to more easily conquer and intimidate their enemies. And speaking of intimidation, the Assyrian kings were very keen to publicize their brutality. This was part of their strategy. They specialized in mass executions, public mutilations, pyramids of skulls. And in this way, they were often able to terrorize their enemies into submission, and they made very little secret of it. As a matter of fact, we have many depictions of Assyrian atrocities. Now, while this was successful and many people did surrender to them, it also fueled resentment, as you can imagine. The Assyrians also pioneered the practice of deporting large-scale populations. And so for areas that were particularly troublesome, oftentimes what they would do is they would go in, they would remove the population and just scatter them across their empire. And in this way, they found that they could break local resistance and then import other peoples back into that region and keep the population scattered and disunited. It's believed that at least 2 million people suffered this fate. The most famous was going to be the 10 northern tribes of Israel, who we'll learn about later. In this way, the Assyrians then created a more homogeneous empire. In other words, once people had been uprooted, their loyalties were no longer to that particular region, but now Their only sense of loyalty would have been the empire itself. The Assyrians also began to pioneer innovative ways to extend their territory. Basically, they had two methods of doing this. In some cases, they would just extract tribute. They would leave the local king as long as he had been sufficiently terrified in power, and that king would have to swear allegiance to the Assyrian king, and then he would be forced to pay outrageous tributes, essentially enslaving his population just to pay the Assyrian taxes. And of course, failure to do so would be met with brutal retribution on the part of the Assyrians. In other places, the Assyrians just conquered it and imposed their direct rule on it as a province, ruled directly from Assyria. And then they would tax, conscript, and force the people that lived there under Assyrian law. Now, while many of the tactics we've mentioned were really, really brutal, even by ancient standards, we should also pause to note that the Assyrians did do some things that were positive. They were great road builders, for one. Now, admittedly, these roads were often built so that they could get their troops to places more quickly, but it did facilitate trade. And oftentimes, the Assyrians would station their military in outposts along the territories they had conquered, which did make the areas safer to some degree. Of course, deporting populations was terrible for the people who experienced it, but it did bring some sort of unity to the Middle East. But no matter how much terror the Assyrians attempted to inflict on people, they were never quite able to rest. 650, under Ashurbanipal, who I quoted earlier, marked the height of their power. But it also marked the beginning of the end. The Assyrians were overextended, and this size made it difficult for them to control. They faced repeated internal rebellion from former kingdoms like Babylon and Egypt, who never quite could shake off their memories of the past. They also faced external pressure as well. Outside nomadic groups like the Medes and the Persians, who we'll look at next, began to raid into the empire. And the Assyrians found it like playing a game of whack-a-mole between internal rebellion and external attacks. When attack did come, the Assyrians also found that they didn't really have any loyalty on behalf of the peoples they had conquered. Many of these people resented the terror and heavy tribute that they had to pay, and so they had little loyalty to the Assyrian Empire. And so after the reign of Ashurbanipal, the empire quickly began to fall and collapse like a house of cards. A combination of outside attack by the Persians and the Medes and internal rebellion by the Babylonians began to bring the empire down. And by 612, their own capital had been mercilessly sacked, and the Assyrians got a taste of their own medicine. Now, as I said, the Assyrian Empire was the first of the great empires. And though it wouldn't be fondly remembered, the Assyrians did set the template for later empires. Their military innovations were copied by later empires. Their administrative system with provincial governors and roads would be imitated and improved upon. And their cultural legacy of just being the first empire would be imitated by others. Now, after Assyria collapsed, they were briefly replaced by the Neo-Babylonians. And we call them the Neo-Babylonians to distinguish them from the earlier Babylonians of Hammurabi's time, 1200 years earlier. This empire thrived from about 611 to 539 BC. And from the Babylonian perspective, this was a reassertion of their culture. They claimed leadership of much of what had been the Assyrian Empire, though not all of it. And in many ways, they were just a continuation of Assyrian rule, practicing the same harsh tactics and deportation techniques. Again, the most famous of these deportations was going to be the southern Jewish kingdom of Judah. And this kingdom was made famous, for those who know biblical history, by the great king Nebuchadnezzar, who sacked Jerusalem and enslaved the Jewish people. But as I said, this was a short-lived empire between two great empires. And so what I want to do is turn to that next great empire. In many ways, the greatest of the ancient empires of the ancient Near East, and that, of course, is Persia. Well, who are the Persians? We haven't really mentioned them yet. Well, the Persians were a group of people who had settled in the Iranian plateau. This is the area, so this is Mesopotamia here. This is the area just to the east over the Zagros Mountains, next to, coincidentally, where the Persian Gulf is. And they had lived in these Iranian highlands for several centuries. And they had been part of these nomadic groups, along with the Medes, that had attacked the Assyrian Empire and helped bring it down, along with the Babylonians. Under their great leader, Cyrus the Great, they began to rapidly expand once the Assyrian Empire had collapsed. Now, as I said, the Neo-Babylonian Empire had taken much of the Mesopotamian heartland, but this area outside in the light pink here, under the Persians and under Cyrus, this area was rapidly conquered. And this included not only these mountainous areas, but all the way into Asia Minor. Cyrus then turned on the Neo-Babylonians, and he conquered the Mesopotamian heartland. Under his successors, Egypt would be conquered, and under Cyrus, this territory was expanded far to the east as well. And the Persians would even go as far as crossing into Europe. And so their territory was going to be much, much larger than anything that had come before, including the Assyrian Empire. They were really going to dwarf that. Now you may be thinking to yourself, great, another empire of brutal savages, but on a much larger scale. But you'd be wrong. Now, the Persians were clearly capable of throwing down and inflicting pain if they needed to. But that's not how they sought to portray themselves. As a matter of fact, Cyrus the Great often liked to portray himself as a great liberator. Unlike the Assyrians, Cyrus portrayed himself as a protector of peoples. And this is some artwork from the Assyrian capital of Persepolis. And what we have here is we have people dressed in different garb. And they're all on a type of pilgrimage to go to see and to pay homage to the great king. And so this artwork represents the people of the world, or the people of the Persian Empire anyways, peacefully going on almost like a type of pilgrimage to see the great king and to pay homage. And we can see here, if we look more closely, we can see that we have a Persian official here leading some of these dignitaries, and he's not doing it at knife point, rather he's holding him by the hand and gently guiding him. And so again, this is propaganda to some degree, but it tells us something about how the Persians like to portray themselves. One of the most famous pieces of writing that we have from this period is what's called the Cyrus cylinder. It's a clay tablet-like thing where Cyrus mentions that he came, conquered the world, but that he also restored temples. That one of the reasons he had to conquer Babylon, for instance, was because the Babylonian kings weren't honoring the gods. And so as he came in, he gave money to restore temples. He allowed displaced people like the Jews to return back to their homeland and gave them money to rebuild their temple. And to the degree that he could, Cyrus went out of his way to respect local traditions. Now, one of the motivating factors behind this may have been the Persian religion. The Persians were part of a religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism tended to divide the world between good and evil. So the whole world fit under this system. And the Persian kings saw themselves as agents of good. They were the protectors of order. And so the Persian kings, sought to unify the diverse peoples and to protect the weak against evil. Now again, probably a little propaganda thrown in there, but it tells us a little bit about their thought world. Another thing about the Persians is, to the degree they could, they would allow local peoples to keep their traditions. They would allow local elites to continue to rule their peoples as long as they were loyal to Persia. Local peoples could keep their religious traditions, their cultural traditions. All they had to do was submit to royal authority and pay their taxes. Now, the Persian king sought to portray grandeur at his royal court. And the king would have very lavish ceremonies at his court, where he would entertain representatives from all the nations of the Persian Empire. Nobles from across this empire would gather. And in the Persian view, this was a symbol of the unity of diversity. All these kings from all over the world would come to worship the great king. And Persepolis was where they sought to show off their grandeur. All right, and so we're looking at some of the ruins of Persepolis. This is where a lot of those reliefs that we saw of people bringing gifts to the Persian king were carved. And the size and splendor of this city was meant to impress all the visitors that came and leave the impression for all of these people to tell, to bring back to their homeland that Cyrus or Xerxes or whoever the king happened to be at that time was truly the king of kings. And so they'd be overawed, hopefully. The Persians also created a very effective administration, really picking up where the Assyrians had left off, but greatly improving it. They divided their kingdom into different satrapies, about 26 in all. A satrapy was a type of province, and the ruler of the province would be called a satrap. And we can see that a lot of these provinces, I'm doing air quotes here, were actually really big. Like, I mean, the province of Assyria was basically the old Assyrian Empire, which was great. Egypt was a province of the Persian Empire. So this just goes to show you the scale and the size. I mean, this empire stretched all the way from India into Europe. Now, the satraps themselves were mostly drawn from the Persian nobility. But as I said, local autonomy was respected as much as possible. People were allowed to retain their own laws, their own customs, their own religion, and oftentimes even their own kings. Like the Assyrians, the Persians were great road builders, only larger. Their greatest project was the Royal Road, which connected the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, 1,500 miles. This road had couriers, or mailmen, if you will, stationed every 20 miles or so. And so the Persian king could get messages out incredibly rapidly across his large empire, right? That's one of the big problems of an empire, is the bigger it gets, the harder it is to communicate. Well, the Persians solved this problem through their courier system. They would just regularly pass this on. The Persians also became the first empire to standardize coin with the king's image on it. And this would help to facilitate trade across this empire. And under the Persians, the Near East experienced a prolonged period of peace for several hundred years. This peace brought stability, brought trade, and most people found living under the Persian Empire to not be that bad. As a matter of fact, later historians have called this the Pax Persica, or the Persian peace, that this empire imposed on this territory. Okay, well, we're going to meet the Persians again when we look at the Greeks, but I want to wrap up this lecture by talking about some of the empires that we've looked at. We started by talking about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which was relatively short-lived, but was pretty innovative in developing a professional army, central administration, creating the infrastructure that would allow the empire to thrive, and the very ideology of empire itself. And while short-lived, it did shape future developments. Certainly, they were inspirations to the Persians, although the Persians learned from the Assyrians that reliance on terror and coercion was ultimately unsustainable. And so maybe in some ways, they were a cautionary tale for later empires. We saw that the Persian model was much more enduring. Under the Persians, the Assyrian model was the good part, well, the parts that they liked were retained, and the parts that didn't work were jettisoned. The Persians, we saw, practiced inclusivity and tolerance to the degree they could, and sought to cooperate with the empire's people. They created an efficient administration through this satrapy system. They connected their empire by the Royal Road, the largest road that had been built up until that time. They standardized trade and communication, and they were an inspiration to future empires like the later Romans. Their imperial ideology was much more compelling and sustainable, and ultimately proved to be more enduring than a policy based off of strictly terror. Now, looking forward, we're going to see that the shadow of these empires is going to loom large in history. Our next lecture is going to be on the Hebrews. And we'll see that the Hebrews would fall victim to the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, but would find liberation under Cyrus. And Cyrus would go on to have a profound effect on the Jewish people. The multicultural model of the great king would go on to inspire the Jewish prophets and fire them up with messianic ideas. Isaiah's vision of a future liberator and a time of peace would in some ways draw off the Persian model of bringing all peoples of the world together. We will also look at the Greeks in future lectures, and we'll see that the Greeks are going to experience the Persians in a different sense, not as liberators, but as enemies and opponents. And as we said, later Romans would go on to borrow many of the imperial policies pioneered by the Assyrians and Persians. And so I will see you in our next lecture on ancient Israel.